Now let's look at the e3 followed by d4 ideas. After the moves c4, c5 and the basic setup, white can castle here or play for immediate e3. We will look at the absolute classical e3 idea, which is played after castling short, and the immediate e3 will be discussed in the next video. So after castling short, I suggest we continue with our setup and just play e6. And here white goes for the e3 d4 idea. We saw the d3 move in the previous video. So e3, knight g e7. And after d4, which is of course white's logical response, we can just castle. Here white has two options. He can either push the pawn forward with d5, but you see there's a Sophia and Keto setup, and white has already wasted time on moves like e3, so this leads to a Benoni structure, which is absolutely okay for black. The alternative, of course, is b3, because white needs to develop the bishop, for example, to b2. So I suppose we start with b3. After b3, I suggest we capture on d4. This has one concrete idea. For example, white can now capture on d4 with his pawn. Then we can go knight f5, hitting the pawn on d4. White will most likely defend the pawn, but here he has also somewhat of a problem. He would like to play d5, but then the knight on c3 is hanging, so he has to play knight e2 to protect the pawn. Here we can play this very typical idea with rook b8. And the idea is to push b5 and activate the rook on the queen side and open up the game. After bishop b2, we just play b5, and after takes, you see we reach a position which is somewhat similar in the idea to Alekhine defense. Because you look at the knights, which are placed on f5 and c6, and the bishop on g7, and they are all targeting this d4 pawn, which cannot move forward. And the future setup for black will be to play bishop to b7 and possibly knight b4, and then put the knight maybe on d5. There is something to be said about d5 here. It is probably not a great idea to play d5, to be honest, because then white's pawn majority on the queen side gets some value here and can be pushed forward. And white and black kind of needs the square d5 for his pieces. So I suggest not to play d5, except of course if there are concrete ideas combined with it. And usually just play for bishop b7, knight b4, and put the piece on d5. So let's go back. White can also capture on d4 with his knight. Here I want to play the same idea. So we capture on d4, generating this one target on d4, and play knight f5. Again, we hit d4. And white has basically two options. He can either play knight e2 to protect the pawn, or he can play bishop e3. After bishop e3, we can continue with a move like rook b8, which is the typical idea here. And for example, rook c1 to protect the knight. And here we can play captures on e3, or we can immediately go for a6, b5. Sometimes it's combined with a move bishop to d7. You have a good choice here. Knight e3, a6, both good moves. So let's go back. Knight e2 is usually the move they play. They don't want to give up the bishop, and they want to place that bishop on b2. Now again, rook b8, and the idea again is to push b5. After bishop b2, b5, we are threatening to capture on c4. White has to capture on b5, and we get a very similar position to what we saw previously. And black's next move after, for example, a move like queen d2 is to play bishop to b7, exchange those bishops, and the position should be a little bit better for black, I suppose. We might use this d5 square eventually and blockade the pawn. There are no problems for black in this position. So let's go back to castle short. There's another idea white can try if he just wants to draw the game, which should be probably mentioned. It's taking on c5, d takes c5, and just exchanging queens. But this is generally absolutely no problem for black. You can play a6 and bishop b6 and bishop a6, and then target the pawn on c4, which is troublesome to defend actually, because b3 is not working for white, because the knight on c3 always is a target for black. So this position you can play as easily for a win as black. So let's look at the most critical line, which is d5. Here, usually people who play the Benoni will auto capture on d5, but I suggest we play knight a5 instead. The idea is we are attacking a pawn on c4, and only after white defends this pawn, we will capture on d5. Basically, we force white to waste a move on a pawn that will, after our next move, probably not stand there anymore. Here white can, for example, try queen to d3, protect the pawn on c4. We capture on d5, and white should most likely recapture with the pawn. In those structures, I just want to point out that black generally has a little bit of a space disadvantage, somewhat of a cramped position, and this explains why white should keep pieces and black should exchange some pieces. Because of the cramped position, your pieces are not as easily finding some good squares, so you are very optimistic when you can just exchange some minor pieces. And after you exchange some minor pieces, white will not have enough pieces to defend the entire area of the board he has occupied. Here in this structure, it's of course a very good idea to use the majority, which is on the queen side. White's majority is in the center, which means white's idea eventually should be to push for e4, e5, and black can immediately play a6. And that is combined with the idea of playing b5, and in this concrete situation, white cannot do much about it. For example, if he tries to stop that, you immediately see that the b3 square can be exploited. You can immediately go for knight to b3, maybe capture on c1 if you like, but you can also play this line with c4, push the queen back to, for example, e2, and play bishop g4, which makes sense. You want to exchange some minor pieces, and it's not such a bad idea actually to exchange the bishop for the knight in those structures, because it's more about control of squares, and generally speaking you control the dark squares and you allow white to somewhat control the light squares. For example, one idea for black in the future would be to play rook b8 and play for b5 to push forward his pawn majority on the queen side. And another, or also based on that idea, you can play knight b3, c5 to d3. So this is not a problem at all for black. So let's go back. Knight e2 is another move. also protecting the pawn on c4. Now, again, we capture on d5. And here, white usually recaptures with a pawn. Just to point out, knight takes on d5. To place a piece on d5 is not really a problem for black, because you can just play bishop e6. And you see, we are most likely able to exchange the bishop, because it needs to stay on d5 to protect c4. Which means white eventually will have all those light square weaknesses around his king, which is not something he wants. And basically, the entire concept of placing a piece on d5 fails. This was one game played by Daniel Dubov, for example. So e takes d5, c takes d5. And here you can play rook b8, again with the same idea, pushing b5. White usually does not want to allow that easily, so he plays a4 to stop b5, and we can insist with a6. There's not really a good way for white to stop this advance. I mean, you could also support it eventually with a move like bishop to d7. White cannot stop this move b5. So after, for example, queen c2, you just push b5, and you have this nice pawn majority on the queen side. You might advance it eventually with b4 or c4. And for white, he has the fianchetto bishop set up, and he is not really ready to push e4 and e5, which are the critical lines in the Benoni. So this is a very, very good Benoni for black. And now we can, in the next video, look at some other e3 ideas, and see you soon.